Carl, shall we start? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the MVP webinar on Stoicism and suicides. My name is Hazel Atuel. I'm a research associate professor here at the Center for Innovation and Research in Veterans and Military Families. And I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Carl Castro, who will be our presenter for this webinar. Dr. Castro is a full professor at USC, where he holds a joint appointment at the School of Social Work and Department of Psychology. He is also a director of the Military Veterans Program and director of RAND-USC Epstein Family Foundation Center for Veterans Policy Research. He retired from the Army after serving more than 30 years, where he obtained the rank of colonel. He is currently chair of a NATO research group on military veteran transitions, co-chair of another NATO research group on military and veteran radicalization and extremism, a Fulbright scholar, and a member of several Department of Defense and Veteran Affairs advisory board. He has authored over 200 scientific articles and reports on numerous military topics. He is one of the world's leading thinkers on military behavioral health, and Dr. Castro has developed theories and conceptual frameworks on topics that include military-civilian transition, military sexual assault, diversity and inclusion, moral injury, and veteran radicalization and extremism, just to name a few. This afternoon, Dr. Castro will be sharing his thoughts on how Stoic philosophy can inform our understanding of suicides in the military. Carl?
Thank you. If we could pull up the first slide. Thank you, Hazel, for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to encourage everyone throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. And at the end, we'll try to get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. And also, we're going to make these slides available. And also, this presentation is being recorded, so don't worry about trying to capture all the notes that you want to write down or anything like that. We'll certainly provide these things to you, or the slides to you, so anything on the slides you'll get. So I do want to begin first by saying happy Cinco de Mayo to everyone out there. And then, but most importantly, probably is really acknowledging Dr. Hazel Atuel, who is a co-author and is facilitating this presentation. So thank you, Hazel. And although I'm going to be doing the talking, Hazel certainly could have given this presentation, and certainly if you have any questions for her at the end, just put those in the chat box as well. So what I'm going to talk about today, from the title you can see, I'm going to talk about suicide and Stoicism, and really embrace the philosophy of how you live your life determines how you lead your life. So next slide. So first, purpose. So what, again, I'm going to present another way of thinking about suicides for both, and I'm going to show some data, not data that I collected, but data from the CDC and the Department of Veterans Affairs, and some data from the active duty to kind of contextualize the scope of the problem. And I really do want to acknowledge Greg Bryan's work on rethinking suicides. For those of you who haven't seen his book that came out, I think is copyrighted 2022, but I think it actually came out late last year. And so for those of you who haven't seen his book, please take a look at it. Many of the ideas that Hazel and I will be presenting today, you will find in his book as well. One of the interesting things that Professor Bryan does do is he views suicide as a wicked problem. And by that, what he means, it's a very complicated problem. When you make one change in one place, you can have unintended consequences in another place, which makes the problem very difficult to solve. And of course, the military and the VA and the nation has been grappling with the issues of suicide literally for decades, if not centuries. Also, in Dr. Brian's book is this idea that we have to embrace thinking differently about suicides, and maybe sometimes to the point of feeling uncomfortable entertaining new ideas. So I hope to make you feel a little uncomfortable today about how to think and approach suicides. But at the same time, I know for many of us, certainly for me, suicides are deeply personal, and I recognize that up front. And if at any point during the talk, I just want folks to feel free to reach out to the suicide hotline. I've put the number here for you. So I realize this is a very, very difficult issue, and therefore we're going to take a very serious but very different way of thinking about it. So in some ways, I'm going to add to the discomfort level of something that's sometimes uncomfortable to talk about. Next slide. So as you all know, as Hazel said in the intro, I'm a retired Army officer, and of course they teach us to tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. So here is what I'm going to cover in the presentation today. One of the things that's really important to emphasize up front, and I'll try to do this throughout the presentation, we must appreciate that suicides are very rare events. I know at the national level, there are a lot of them, but they're very distributed. And because they're such rare events in this distributed fashion, it's really hard to study them with the scientific rigor that we would like. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. And then we're going to go over some of the data. As I already mentioned, we'll talk about the Stoic suicide paradox, dying with honor, and then really some observations about some of the key data. I will also very briefly touch on a dual pathway model of suicide. I'm going to talk about the military's approach broadly to addressing suicides, and I hope I don't offend anyone who's from the military on how I characterize it. It's going to be a very broad characterization. And then we're going to talk about some dark moments that we all go through or may go through in life that we could do a better job preparing for. Then I'm going to talk specifically about leader actions, and then the Stoic approach versus the current approach, which I've labeled an impairment model, which some people may take exception to, but again, I'm kind of overstating it for presentation purposes. And then again, I'll end with next steps. So I'm not going to end with a summary of telling you what I just told you. So I'm telling you now what I'm going to tell you, then I'll tell you, and then we're going to end it. Then we'll open it up for questions. Okay, next slide. So why are suicides rare events? I just said they're rare events. People may say, well, there's thousands happening every year. They're not so rare, but in a per 100,000 basis, they're fairly rare. And why are they rare? Well, these are reasons that people have come up with, and I think they're reasonable. One is we must overcome the human instinct to live. If every human being was susceptible to dying by suicide, the species would quickly fall out, right? We become extinct. So we have this will, this instinct to live. And there are also cultural and religious barriers that prevent folks from dying by suicide. And sometimes when folks do die by suicide, there'll be cultural and religious reasons why it's not called a suicide, it's called something else. And humans are very resilient. You know, this is another presentation, but soldiers, veterans, a human being, we are a very, very resilient group, both physically and psychologically. And sometimes we don't give enough credit to that resilience that we all have. There are infinite number of reasons to live. We can all think of maybe one or two reasons that we may want to die, but there are lots of reasons to live. And then also there's this belief in a better afterlife makes the vast majority of our current situations, although unpleasant, bearable. Okay, so again, this ties into perhaps religious beliefs, or even if you're not a religious person from an organized religion, you may have a belief about afterlife that's not tied to any particular religion that allows you to sort of bear the unbearable because you know in the next life things are going to be better. Next slide. So again, we're going to go quickly over some data. I I could spend days talking about suicide data. So I just want to highlight some key things that I think we just need to keep in mind when we talk about it. First, there's very, very important sex differences between those who die by suicide. So you can see from this slide at a glance without even trying to read the numbers. This, by the way, is data from the CDC website. You can go right there and get it yourself and see lots more data. But you can clearly see here, men are much more likely, or males are much more likely to die by suicide than females. And I don't think that's surprising to anybody, but just kind of keep that in mind. Another interesting thing about this trend from 2000 to 2020, keep in mind, this is a 20-year time horizon, is you can see the total rate is going up slightly. And then it looks like now we may be on a slight downcline. Okay, so just keep that in mind as well. We may be on a little slight decline, but you can see overall over the last 20 years or so, there's been this steady increase in suicides. And this is the US population, by the way. This is the US population. Next slide. Here's one by age. I think many of us know this. And the one that really grabs you is the top one, which is the 45 to 64-year-old group is the highest group. But you can also see this precipitous drop in the last couple of years, which I think is really, really important. And again, you can see the overall rates of suicides by age. So not every age is at equal risk, right? That's the important point. And males and females are not at equal risk, right? There's some groups that are more at risk than others. And when we get into the military data, you can see one of the highest risk groups is the age 25 to 44. And then the 15 to 24 is kind of this merging. It's not really the exact military age that we want, but it just gives you an overall perspective of the population. Again, you can see these slight increases, but then, maybe the 45 to 60-year-old is going down. But at the very youngest age, you can start seeing, you see this kind of increase that seems to plateau, but maybe still slightly increasing. Okay, so again, just want you to be familiar with the data that's happening in the larger American population. Next slide. So this slide jumps out in because of the crossover. So you can see homicides were actually a greater cause of death than suicides for many, many years. But you can see at about 2010, they started crossing over. And now suicides account for more deaths in America than homicides. So if you think about it just from how much effort, how much money do we spend in preventing murders, prosecuting murders, and just the cost of that. And then you can see that suicides is even more, resulting in more death. Next slide. Now, this is not the latest slide. It's actually 1 year old, I think, and maybe 2 years old. This is the suicide rates for active duty. And you can see since 2008 or 10, really, you can see it goes up and down, kind of up, then down, then up, and then kind of a steady increase for the next 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And I think the data that came out just a few months ago, it's now, I think, at 36.1 per 100. So it's still going up. I honestly didn't think it could go any higher than around 24, 25 per 100,000, but clearly I'm wrong about that. You can see it's still going up. A lot of these rates are driven by soldiers' death, this active duty data. But you can see it's an ongoing problem. And that's important because remember I showed you earlier where it looked like maybe the rates were starting to decline again. And now they're going back up. Okay, now they're going back up. So I just want folks just to keep that in mind, that there's overall trends, but then there's sub-trends that we have to pay attention to, that we must pay attention to. Otherwise, solutions we come up with may be good for one particular group, but not another particular group. Next slide. So here are veteran suicides, and for whatever reason, the VA likes to report data by numbers as opposed to per 100,000. And I could go through and recalculate all these. I didn't do that. But the point here is there's a lot of veterans who die by suicide. That's what this graph is really capturing. And I think that's what you can take away from it. It does fluctuate, it goes up and down, and keep in mind that sometimes these things that look like, oh, wow, that's a really big drop, we're making progress, it can be going back up the next year. So you can't get too excited about a 1 or 2 or even 3-year change. You really need to take a 5, 6, 7-year horizon to see whether or not what you're doing is working. In terms of interventions, whether it's treatment or education or early intervention or recovery, you really need to take a longer horizon. Next slide. So here is another slide that's more recent. You can see it looks like the overall number has dropped, but again, don't get caught up in the number going down, although that's really important. We want to look if we're making progress against the problem. We need to take a look at it per 100,000. But again, you can see whether it's going down or staying the same, it's still a problem. We still have 5,000 to 6,000 veterans dying by suicide every year and have been for the last 2 decades. That's the take-home message. Next slide. So what did the Stoics, well, one, Socrates is not a Stoic, but he really is a virtue philosopher. And one of the things that kind of jumps out when you think about Socrates is he was a military veteran. Okay, most people don't think of Socrates as a military veteran, but he was a military veteran. So he experienced combat up close. And he also died by suicide. Now one could argue he was forced to drink the poison, the hemlock poison, but he also died by suicide. Maybe one could say he was coerced into it. But what did he say? What did the Stoics think? What did the ancient philosophers think about suicide, and how did they think about it? Next slide. So thinking about that question, and we move to what I will call the modern, or some folks said, Admiral Stockdale served in the Vietnam War, and I was accused, well, that's not very modern, but good grief, he only died maybe 10 years ago. But Admiral Stockdale was a Navy pilot who was one of the first pilots captured during the Vietnam War, and he was kept a prisoner for nearly 8 years, just over 7.5 years, at the famous Hanoi Hilton, where he was tortured almost daily. And he reached a breaking point. We talk about how sometimes, combat, everyone has a breaking point in combat. And we eventually, if we keep going long enough, we'll all break down. We'll all suffer from battle fatigue or post-traumatic disorder, or we'll need to take a break. One could say the same thing about torture. We all have a breaking point. And at some point, Admiral Stockdale, he was actually a captain at the time. He was a Navy captain when he was captured. He reached a breaking point where he attempted to take his own life, but it was actually saved by his captors. His captors intervened because they didn't want him dying for political purposes. But what it convinced his captors was that this guy's never going to break. He would rather die, even by his own hand, than collude with the enemy against his own country. And this is an excerpt from his Congressional Medal of Honor commendation that he received about 3 years after his release. And look what it says. It says he deliberately inflicted a near mortal wound to his person in order to convince his captors of his willingness to give up his life rather than capitulate. Now, notice they didn't use the word he attempted suicide, but he attempted suicide, right? That's exactly what this says. And that's exactly how Admiral Stockdale talked about it. He reached his breaking point. But importantly for the Stoics, death itself is what gives urgency to the meaning of life. So think about that. And many soldiers who served in combat say the same thing. Being in combat, experiencing death, told them what are the things that are important in life, what things are not important, but what things are important. And it's this very possibility that we choose to leave life voluntary or involuntary that gives us the courage to do what is right in otherwise unbearable circumstances. So again, we're coming back to this. How do you live with virtue? How do you live with dignity in unbearable circumstances? Next slide. So let's first talk about what suicide is. Most of us would say, or we're certainly taught, that suicide is a non-virtuous death. I've heard commanders tell me he took the coward way out, killed himself, or he couldn't face up to his responsibility. I'm going to talk about that, but literally, suicide means self-murder. Right? If you look at suicide, it means to kill oneself, so it's self-murder. But maybe suicide we can think about as choosing to die without honor. So it's contextual now. And there are lots of ways to die without honor. There's lots of ways to die with honor. And what I want us to do is start thinking about, Hazel, so let's thinking about how we can distinguish between these two ways. What are some ways that we can think about that is dying with honor or without honor? Next slide. So I'm just checking my clock here so I don't run over. So dying without honor. So I think we all agree if you take your own life to escape responsibility for your actions, to punish those you've left behind, to refuse to live a virtuous life, succumbing to short-term or simply temporary setbacks. So, my girlfriend who I really love left me, but that's temporary, right? It's temporary. A lot of us face girlfriends or boyfriends, spouses or husbands leaving us. Those are temporary setbacks. And it's embracing vices versus virtues. Some people, the hedonist, there's a whole philosophy around that where you embrace the vices over the virtues, or you become sort of from a cultural perspective, they may call you a counterculturalist, but that's not what we're really talking about. We're really talking about folks who embrace, being mean, being spiteful, being self-centered, not caring for the greater good as being embracing vices over virtues. Next slide. So the Stoics talk about this open door, right? The open door, and the open door says the Stoics identify 5 reasons when suicide may be suitable. Not when it is suitable, but when it may be suitable. One of them is when you have this unbearable pain that you just can't take anymore. You're in so much pain and so much agony, you just can't bear it anymore. When you find that when you believe you're useless or a burden to society, family, or friends. And many of these, by the way, you'll see in Thomas Joiner's interpersonal psychological theory of suicide, where he talks about being a burden to others. For principled reasons, in defense of a cause. Think about Admiral Stockdale. I would rather die by my own hand than collude with the enemy. Is that a reason to take one's own life? Personal dignity, right? You don't want people to see you, say, in a demented state or a physically decrepit state, or to safeguard others, okay? Now, an important note here is one considers the open door when life no longer affords the opportunity to be a virtuous person, or when death is more virtuous than doing something at a particular time and place. Think to Socrates. Rather than recant his beliefs, he would rather take him life. Next slide. Now, there are numerous actions that involve dying with honor, that is, knowingly giving up one's life. And these actions are not suicide. No one even thinks of them as suicide, although they knowingly can lead to one's death. And the classic example in the military is throwing one's yourself on a hand grenade to save the lives of a fellow member. No one says, oh, you died by suicide. You say you died of virtues, you were a hero. You saved other people's lives. You usually get a medal for valor for doing that. Giving up one's place on a lifeboat for the wounded when a ship is sinking. No one's saying that's suicide, although for sure you're going to die. Charging the enemy. There are lots and lots of stories of soldiers and Marines from every war charging, machine gun fire or putting themselves at knowing risk that they're going to die. And then there are religious martyrs. These are examples from the Bible, Peter, John, even Jesus. They knew they were going to die and they went anyway. So they didn't recant their faith. No one would call that suicide. On any of these cases, I don't think anyone would say, oh, that was suicide because you willingly went to your death. I don't think anyone would say that. And there are lots of others I'm sure folks can think about. This is what the open door, dying in order to die virtuously. This is the idea of the open door. Next slide. Now, of course, many of you know the Werther effect, right? The Werther effect are these copycat suicides or suicide contagion phenomena. We all talk about that. And of course, this is a bit of background. The Werther effect comes from the name Werther, who was in Goethe's novel. Okay, so he was a character in Goethe's novel who died by suicide, and everyone thought that others would copycat it. In fact, there's some data to indicate that, and therefore this book has been banned for many years in many countries to prevent that from happening. And from that came guidelines for how the media should report deaths by suicide to prevent contagion from happening. These guidelines were developed primarily, well, not primarily, but initially for grade school kids to keep kids in grade school, middle school, high schools from copycatting, but it's been subsequently extended to the adult population as well. And one of the things that's interesting to know, in a recent paper, maybe a couple of years old now, someone went through the news clippings, the newspapers about suicides, whether they were a military or a veteran, and compared them to civilian, and found that the media were more likely to violate the guidelines for how to report deaths by suicide when it was a veteran or an active duty military than when it was a civilian, indicating that this could lead to the contagion. Next slide. So we also know about suicide by proxy. And what is that? That is when you deliberately expose yourself in a life situation where you may be killed. But again, lots of examples with the military, but this was very, very common phenomenon, or appeared to be a common phenomenon in the 80s and 90s, where folks would commit crimes so the police would kill them because, their will to survive, their religious beliefs, they could never take their own lives, so they engaged in actions with the police where the police would shoot them. And of course, this sometimes is known as a suicide proxy by police. So, and then of course, engaging in extreme risk-taking behaviors as well. Doing drugs, things like that, that would put yourself at high risk because you really wanted to die, but you couldn't do it yourself. So you were looking for other means to do it. Next slide. Now, of course, there are problems with this open door policy that the Stoics talk about, right? And what are they? Well, there's a real danger that someone will kill themselves for no good reason, right? Is there ever a good reason to kill yourself? Someone may say, there's never a good reason to kill yourself. Well, I gave you some reasons that the Stoics said were good reasons, but some may say, well, there's never any good reason, and you may pick a frivolous reason. And not all decisions are right decisions, right? From a judgmental perspective, right? So if you're judging one's actions, you can say, well, that was wrong, that was right. But the power of choice and the power of control is what makes Stoicism a very powerful philosophy. So the Stoics believe that you are in control and that you make the decisions. You decide, not somebody else. And that's really hard to kind of give that up, right? To give up that power of decision, that power of control. But in point of fact, every service member, every veteran has that control, whether we want them to have it or not, to take their own line. Whether we want them to have it or not, they are in control. So we can accept that and work from that premise, or we can try to structure things so they're not in control. The latter is really, really difficult to do. I would argue embracing their power of control, starting from there and working from that, may lead to better outcomes when it comes to the decision to end one's life. Next slide. So what are some of the key findings? And I'm just going to summarize them here in bullet form, but I'm happy to share all the references. This is not my work as much as it's other people's work. So active duty suicides have risen significantly over the past 3 or 4 decades, whether it goes up or down, the trend is up, it's elevated, and they remain elevated. So whether or not they're continuing to go up, we can argue about that. That's not the point. The point is they're elevated, and there's no evidence that they're dropping precipitously among veterans or active duty folks. Maybe we can see pockets. Maybe the Air Force is doing a little bit better this year, but next year it's somebody else. But I'm talking over a sustained 5, 6, 7-year period. The 3 points that service members appear to be, well, not appear to be, if you look at the data shows that service members and veterans are most likely to die by suicide when they first join the military, within the first couple years, upon returning home from a deployment. And it doesn't even have to be a combat deployment, but that's where we have the best data. And when leaving the military and returning back to civilian life, so that transition out of the military. So you can see there's these kind of 3 key transition points where service members and veterans are at the most risk. Next slide. Now we know that 80 to 90% of active duty suicides have occurred within 1 year or less of the service member seeing behavioral health care. Okay, so what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen are doing a fantastic job of referring people to behavioral health care, right? You look at that, we're only missing 10, 20%. That's pretty good, right? So all of that training that the military has done about detecting strange behavior that's not typical, giving things away, the trigger warnings, all of those things, it appears to be that the military is doing a pretty good job of at least getting them to behavioral health care. Now you could say, well, it must be behavioral health care that's failing. Not necessarily, because not all deaths by suicide are because someone has a mental health problem. And behavioral health care is focused on, well, is there a behavioral health problem? If a service member denies being suicidal, then and there's no mental health disorder or even an inkling of one, it's really hard to intervene, because what would you intervene for? Okay. Approximately 70% of elderly veterans who die by suicide have been to behavioral health within the last 90 days. So that's something else to think about. So it's not necessarily a problem of getting them there. Effective treatments remain elusive. We have some treatments that might be useful, but a really good one is we just don't have it yet. And because suicides are very rare events, it's hard to validate these effective treatments. So, there's a lot of things working against getting good treatments. Also, because suicides are so final, a lot of times we don't want to do the necessary work to get evidence-based interventions. So we'll give it a best guess, which we call what? We call it evidence-informed. Anytime you hear anyone who's listening, anytime someone says evidence-informed, that means it's not evidence-based. It means they've taken things from theory and a bit of data here and there, and we think this should work, okay? Look what's happened over the last 40 years. That approach is not working, okay? That approach is not working, okay? So I'll just leave that there, okay? None of the military suicide prevention efforts that the military ones have been shown to be effective in terms of prevention, okay? I'm talking not treatment, but on the prevention side. every service has a suicide prevention effort. None of them are evidence-based. None of them are evidence-based. Now, someone will say, well, yes, but if we didn't have those, suicide rates could be even higher. Okay, I've heard that argument. That might be true. Who knows? It could actually make it worse, right? Because keep in mind, anything that can be helpful can be harmful. So if you think this is helpful, what harm are you doing? So anytime someone wants to do an intervention, I always say, well, what harm can this intervention cause? And if they say, well, it can't cause any harm, then I know it can do no good because it's not active. All right. Anything that can be beneficial can be harmful. And there's no such thing as the perfect, never causes harm, only causes good. Okay. There's no such thing that exists. So if it can be helpful, it can also be harmful. And what we want to do is make sure it's not causing more harm than the good it's doing. And the only way you know that is by doing careful research studies where you look at both the benefits and the cost, the risk of an intervention. Next slide. So this is just a brief comment about combat and suicide. People, a lot of folks think, I know for those of you on this webinar, in the media, it's the combat that's causing all the suicide, but that's not true. It contributes for sure, but it's not the only cause. And just from a sense of combat, what you hear from soldiers based on qualitative studies that I actually have been involved in is soldiers, I say, when they go through combat and suicides, it's the three odds. It's incomprehensibility. You know, it's hard to understand what's going on. Folks who've been through combat sometimes feel invincible. And then they get to this point where they think when their number's up, it's up, there's nothing they can do about it. So then life becomes inevitable, death becomes inevitable. And it's these conflicting ideas. Now, soldiers don't necessarily use these words. These are the words I'm using. They use different words, like it didn't make any sense. This person who died was the best person, or someone close to us who died by suicide. I didn't see it coming. You know, what's going on here? And so a lot of it is just hard to understand, and it's hard to accept, because when you don't understand it, when you see things that don't make any sense, well, then you say, well, it's because it was inevitable, or there's nothing we could have done about it. We just kind of throw our hands up. A lot of people think that about suicide. Nothing we can do. If somebody decides to do it, nothing I can do about it. Well, I think that there are, when someone decides to do something, I just talked about choice and control. I agree with that, but there are things we can do. Next slide. This is a dual pathway for how combat can lead to dying by suicide. So, you know, the first one is sort of the classic one that folks think about. It's you have acute stress reaction, leads to post-traumatic stress disorder, that can change into depression over time, that leads to suicidal ideation, that can lead by dying by suicide. So this is sort of the classic one when people think about combat and PTSD and its relationship to dying by suicide. Now, keep in mind, before the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you look at whether or not PTSD was a risk factor for suicide, it wasn't. Look at data, look at risk factors before 2000. Look at those papers. It'll say things like depression was the main one, okay? Notice that's also in the pathway here. But PTSD wasn't. I think it's because PTSD was not a commonly diagnosed mental health disorder before the Iraq and Afghanistan war. So you get a different risk profile, which tells us something about how our diagnostic categories and all of that works, but that's a different lecture. And then the second one, and this is some work that Dr. Hazel Atuel and I have done and others, showing that, you know, moral and ethical combat can lead to moral and ethical violations, not just combat, but in this example, I'm using combat as the main stress or the main trauma, which can threaten one's identity, which can lead to a moral injury, which many actually have heard about. Moral injuries then can lead to suicidal ideation, which can lead to dying by suicide. And we think these are two related but independent pathways. We don't show the connections here. We have several papers coming out. A few have actually already come out that kind of talks about this in more detail for those who are interested. Next slide. I see I'm up on time. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So here are things that I now want you to sort of, this kind of all by way of background, which was a lot of ways to say, let's think about this differently. So currently, we've taken this approach that all suicides are preventable. It comes off in the deal, one suicide is one too many, okay? And the idea from that is that they're all preventable. There's also this idea, and these also, by the way, you'll see these ideas on Rethinking Suicide by Greg Ryan, that all suicides involve mental or behavioral health issues, and we know they don't. Maybe slightly over half appear to have a mental health component, but many of them don't. Some of them times are legal issues, financial issues, moral identity issues that I just mentioned. That there's also this belief that suicides can be prevented through continuous training and awareness, focusing on knowing the warning signs and symptoms. I mentioned that already. And if we don't think that, then why is the military training focused on that? Because we think that. We think, oh, if we just recognize the symptoms and get rid of it. We also think that all service members are at equal risk of dying by suicide. Now, if we don't think that, I don't know if people really think that. That's just how the training's conducted, right? Once a year, everybody in the military gets this training, whether you are 17, 18, 19, or 50 or 60 getting ready to leave the military. Everybody gets the same training around the same time. No, it's not tailored for risk or timing. It's just everyone gets it at the same time. When suicides happen, leaders and other unit members fail to detect the signs that a service member is under duress. So it becomes this blaming your buddy for not, you should have seen that Castro was struggling. Why didn't you give him help? This is on you. What kind of climate are the leaders setting? What policies do we have? So again, it becomes this blaming. Now, interestingly, around from like 1980 to 1990s, the military suicide training was blaming the person who died by suicide. So they were saying, look what you did, look what you caused. And they would actually show training films. And the ones from the Air Force were the most amazing, where they would show like an airman who died by suicide, and then they would show the impact that death had on their mother. The mother would be crying and look what you've done. Or they'd show the wife or the children. It was very, very emotional. And this was kind of shame or guilt someone into not choosing to die by suicide. So we've moved away from that and now moved to really, I would argue, is blaming your buddies, your wingman, as opposed to, or the leaders for not setting a climate, for getting help, etc. And then there's also this belief that every behavioral healthcare person knows how to effectively spot treat a service member who is suicidal. And we have good treatments for doing so. So this is kind of the assumptions, either implied or explicitly stated, in most of the military suicide prevention efforts. Next slide. Well, what we would like to say or like to suggest is acknowledge that first, that the military's current impairment approach to ending suicide is not working. I've shown you the data. It doesn't look like it's working, but more importantly, it's not likely to. All right. So after about 2 decades, is it safe to say doing something for 2 decades is still high and elevated? It's not working. At what point do you say what we're doing is not working? This approach is not working. Okay, so we've used it for a long time. It's gotten worse, maybe stabilized, maybe even getting worse. Let's just say, it's stabilized. I'll give you that. I'll be very conservative. It's stabilized. It still isn't working. It's not bringing them down. I think we need to embrace the fact that every soldier, every service member has the power to decide how they live their life and how they die. They actually get to decide. We may not like that. We may want to influence it. We should try to influence it, but we have to accept that. Know that every service member who's considering, not every service member who's considering dying by suicide has a mental health disorder. We have to acknowledge that. There are other factors involved. I've mentioned many of them already. We could talk about this for the next hour. There's lots and lots of different factors. Recognize that moral failure contributes to a service member dying by suicide. I know it says soldier here. It should say service member. Next slide. So what we think we can do is prepare all service members for dark moments, right? And what are some known dark moments that we all might have? Well, experiencing intense physical pain. Being in the military, we could hurt ourselves at any moment, either in combat or not, carrying heavy stuff, hurting our back, hurting knees, okay? Belief that others would be better off if you never existed. We all kind of have these thoughts, right? These are dark moments, right? But what do we do when we have these dark moments? They're moral failure to uphold a deeply held belief. We're not perfect. We're human beings. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to let others down, but more importantly, we're going to let ourselves down. What do we do when that happens? We have these, all of us at some point probably had some feeling of being rejected or not wanted or not appreciated or being embarrassed publicly. Okay, that we're burdens to others. How can we handle those situations when they arise, especially during the aging process? Remember, I mentioned some of the older folks who die by suicide. Death, crime, right? Knowing that we're going to be in big trouble. These are dark moments. What can we do to prepare service members and veterans and others for when these dark moments happen? Next slide. So the next couple of slides, and then I'm going to end because I do want to save time for questions, is what actions can leaders take? And here they are here, but we empower service members by instilling military values. Every service has military values. And I know most of us, when we first are introduced to them, we think they're hoo-ha, who cares about these things, courage, commitment, all of these things. But they are meaningful if you adopt the Stoics and the Greek philosophers' approach to the importance of virtues in how we lead our life. Enable service members to live with honor, even when they are experiencing dark moments. Don't throw them under the bus, right? Don't cut somebody loose the minute they make a mistake. So, right, that's hard. That's hard to do. Well, you stupid, why did you do that? I'm cutting you loose. You're going down. I'm throwing you in jail, right? We've got to move away from that. We've got to move away from that. Embrace diversity through rigorous cohesion building, both formal and informal. People need to feel they belong. People need to feel they belong, and it ties into this next bullet. They need to have a sense of meaning from their military service. I belong, and what I'm doing is meaningful. And then I mentioned we need to prepare service members for dark moments. Okay, now that's a whole nother set of lectures, but I think you all have some ideas on how we could prepare each other for dark moments and support each other. Next slide. And then we need to rebuild, right? So when a suicide happens, we need to rebuild. The first thing we've got to stop doing is blaming other people. Quit blaming the buddies, quit blaming the leaders, quit blaming the organization, quit blaming the culture. I'm not saying those things aren't important, but let's rebuild that. Let's take a look at what is it we're doing. Can we do it better without blaming people, without you should have seen this and this is going to reflect on your leadership ability kind of thing. Recognize moral failures as temporary setbacks that everybody experiences, yet mostly everybody recovers from, okay? We keep having moral failures though, that could be an issue, but most accept honest mistakes. And I've added this, we also have to accept dishonest mistakes. Sometimes people do things for the wrong reasons. We need to turn those into learning experiences. And like I said, and not just cut them loose. View moral failures as an injury to one's character. And if you do that, then that requires a moral-based intervention, not a medical or a clinical-based intervention. Okay, so it's a different approach. Develop a team approach. And the military does this to some extent, but we need to do it in spades. But include mentors in that process. Chaplains, of course, behavioral health care, of course, and other unit members. So that's the team approach. It's everyone. Everyone has a role to play, not my role is more important than your role. all of these members, and I'm sure you can think of others, families and communities. So, this is not an exhaustive list, but the idea is it's got to be a team approach to this. And it can't be about cutting people loose. Next slide, right? I'll come back to that. So this slide I just put together because sometimes, well, what are you saying? What are you proposing that's different than the current approach? So I think the current approach is impairment focused. I think the Stoic one is strength-based approach. So here's the thing. I think Stoics focus on your strengths. It focuses on building, by strengths, I mean, it focuses on virtues. It focuses on meaning, having a meaningful life, a blessed life. It's strength-based. It builds character. It values life with honor. It's tailored to skill development. It emphasizes cohesion and mentoring, and it's outcome focused. So is it working? Let's look at the data. If it's not working, then we need to make some changes. The current model is simply focused on pathology. Get them into behavioral health care, get them a diagnosis. Oh, let's blame the buddies, blame the leaders. The training becomes a check the box, not validated. Do we know it's working? I don't know if it's working, but we're doing something, right? Remember the old adage, don't confuse activity with progress, okay? And training is focused on identifying signs and symptoms as opposed to building skills, instead of building character, instead of instilling values. It's a one size fits all versus tailoring to the needs, right? No matter where you are in the deployment cycle, no matter where you are in the military career, no matter what your age is, everybody gets the same stuff. No tailoring done at all. And I think that the military's approach really is hoping for improvement. To be honest, I don't see any real rigorous assessments of the training interventions that they're doing. Is it making a difference? Are people more aware? Are people more educated? Have they developed more skills? What are those skills? It just seems like let's just do this and hope it works. And I think we need to move away from that. Next slide. So our next steps. Now I've talked a lot of thinking about how to think about suicides differently. But all of this needs to be tested. So we need to develop and validate what I'll call the next generation suicide prevention efforts, which I think should be different than what we're doing today, because what we're doing today is not working. I think we should double down on proven interventions. So things like means restriction, gun safety, things that have been shown time and time again, we should double down on that. Consider the social determinants as well as individual factors. So I've been focusing a lot on individual factors, but there's these huge social factors. I mentioned sort of the team approach, those social factors, making people feel wanted, feeling a member of a team. And then we have to be patient. We need to wait and get the evidence-based interventions, but not complacent. That doesn't mean we don't do anything, but we shouldn't just do a bunch of stuff and hope it works. So this is patient, but not complacent. I think it was Admiral Halsey. I can never remember who says this. I've searched the internet till I've looked in my library. I'm in my home. I'm looking around my library now. But during World War II, it was either Halsey or Nimitz said, so keep in mind, this is after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Coral Seas. America has been defeated by the Japanese in 2 or 3 major battles, right? We've lost the Philippines. In the heat of all of that, Admiral Halsey or Nimitz, I can't remember which one now. So if anybody knows the answer, please type that into the chat box. I would appreciate it. And a source if you have it. Said there's no problem so great that a bad solution will do. Now think about that. There's no problem so great that a bad solution will do. I will say suicides in the military is a great problem, but it hasn't met great solutions. It's like, well, let's just try this. And it may be a bad solution, but how do we prevent implementing bad solutions? By making sure they're evidence-based. And if we're not going to do all of the rigor of an evidence-based solution, and I understand why we wouldn't want to, I'm a scientist, a researcher, it takes a lot of time to do those studies, at least build in rigorous assessments and validations of what is being done to see if it really is working and not just hope it works. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I apologize. I got way off track on my time, but we do have a few minutes, I think, left for questions. I'm going to stop there and open it up. And I hope this was informative, and thank you all for those of you who managed to log on. I really do appreciate it. So any questions from the text or the chat that anyone would like to ask?
Carl, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. So here is one question about the Werther effect. Is the Werther effect happening in the Navy in the recent past? Do you know?
Well, you know, I don't know the answer, so I'm not going to say yes or no. It's very difficult to prove the Werther effect. Okay, let me just say that right from the get-go, because it becomes really more, you look at when a suicide happened, and then you look for clusters around it. I think many of you know the Public Health Command in the Army is responsible for doing what they call the epidemiological consultation assessments. And I've been on many, many of those myself in my career. And what you do is you go in and you say, what's going on here? Because they do tend to come in bursts where you'll get 5 or 6, 7, 8 suicides happening at a single Army installation, and primarily in the Army, well, all the ones in the Army that I've been involved in. And we go in and we try to figure out what's going on. And all of what we've learned that goes on, I'm feeding into this presentation. So you have to go in and really do a careful analysis to determine if, because it's usually not a single cause, it's a system approach. It's a system approach from the culture of the organization, to the leadership, to the processes, to what are the chaplains doing, what are the mental health folks doing, all of these folks together, it's a collective thing, and then you come up with a series of recommendations. But it's really hard to say it's this one thing, but they certainly do appear to happen in clusters, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Here's another question. What institutional barriers do you foresee in implementing the military suicide prevention model?
I will tell you the biggest barrier is leaders unwilling to wait or unwilling to support rigorous validation efforts to make sure what they're doing works. By the way, I am not arguing or suggesting we stop doing suicide prevention training, quite the opposite. But what I'm arguing is assess whether or not it's meeting your goals. So if you think this training is making Marines more informed, test them, see if it does. If it's going to have them interact more or be more inclusive and engage in team building, assess that. All of these things are measurable. That's all I'm suggesting. But the biggest obstacle is commanders not wanting to wait for that, or leaders wanting to wait for that, or even assess whether or not their efforts are working. I've been in meetings, I can say this now, I've been out of the military now for almost 10 years. I cannot tell you the number of meetings I've sat in where commanders have told me, I am not waiting on the data to implement this. I've also been in meetings where I said, well, can we assess whether or not it's working? Absolutely not. These are more the political appointees. I'm not going to, because if it turns out it's not working, we'll be criticized for doing something that's not working and be asked why we're doing something that's not working, which I think is the wrong answer. I'm interested in saving lives of service members and veterans. I'm not so much concerned about what media will say. They'll do whatever they do anyway, but let's just get a solution and then worry about how we talk about that solution.
Great, thank you. Here's another very interesting question. Do you think that the military is open to changing to the Stoic approach on suicide prevention?
Well, here's the thing. The military loves Stoic philosophy when it comes to leadership, right? And I think if we show them and demonstrate to them the power of Stoic philosophy, and it's just an approach, it's not the answer. So I hope that no one takes away, this is the answer. I think it can contribute to the content and the approach that we take around suicide prevention and the treatment of individuals who are having suicidal thoughts. I mean, by think about when we send soldiers into combat. I mean, I was involved in developing battle mind training to prepare people for the reality of combat, right? And there, we showed that it, in two very large group randomized trials, that it was effective. We can do something similar, I think, in showing that an intervention can be effective in changing attitudes, in making people feel more inclusive and more connected to each other, because we find that, I mean, the literature is really exploding now, showing feeling connected to other people is a good protector against dying by suicide. And we need to capitalize on what we already know. And so I don't think I'm saying anything that the data, the empirical literature doesn't support.
Right. Related to that point, here's another question. What is essential for human growth and healthy interaction or bonds, to the effect that no one person is thought of as an island?
Well, being a professor of social work, I take a holistic approach to well-being. So the biopsychosocial, spiritual, and financial health, which we often don't include, but those are the five. And a good, people who are well-rounded have all of those. Are your physical health needs being met, or your psychological health, your social, the relationships, right? Your relationships, your spirituality. How do you drive meaning beyond yourself, whether it's through religion or spirituality or some other means? That's really important. And then finances. We don't like to talk about finances, but you need money to live in America, for God's sake. Why am I stating the obvious? I think everybody on this call knows you need money. So we need to take a holistic approach. If someone is in financial straits, they're going to do things that they otherwise maybe not have done, or they're not going to get the care they need. So we've got to take a holistic approach. And once you get balance in across those five domains, I think that's when you're going to have someone who feels they're living a good life, that their life is going well, and they're glad to be in it.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for probably one or two more questions. Here's one. For frontline leaders, how do we encourage them to consider this approach, the proposed approach of Stoicism?
I will say, if you are a frontline leader, I mean, and I'm talking like frontline leader, meaning there's me, and then here are the five people I supervise, that leader. You need to make sure every member of your team feels valued, that they feel included, they feel valued, they feel heard, right? These are all words that you hear in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's so true. And that's, we in the military, we call that what? Cohesion. They feel they're part of the team. They can trust each other, and they can trust you as the frontline supervisor. That's the most important thing that a frontline supervisor can do, is make everyone below them feel they're an important contributing member of the team and they're valued.
Great.
So no bullying, no hazing, no sexual assault, all of these things, right? I mean, all of these things.
This is wonderful. It looks like people are making comments saying that this has been a great presentation, that they learned a lot. And one of the attendees even said that it looks like it's a she who was given 300 battle mind briefs.
Oh, wow.
And it's effective. It's effective. It's worked. So we have more time probably for one more question, and then we'll have Dr. Castro just give us some words of wisdom before we end our webinar. So any more questions? I think we have time for one more question. I think we're good. So, okay. Carl, oh, wait. We have one. What agency could pilot this approach?
Any agency could pilot this approach. This is not suicides. I started off by showing you the problem in America. Each nation has a different level of problems, but there's no nation that solved it. Okay, there's no nation that has solved this problem, and I think there's a lot we can learn from each other, and there's a lot that we can share with each other. There's no one has a monopoly on the solution, and I don't think anybody has a monopoly on, well, it needs to start here because we're the most important. The military is in a unique position in some ways because values are already part of every service, and you can leverage that. And there's a hierarchy, right? There's leader, we have very strict chain of command in all the services. So there are things that can be leveraged in a positive way, I think, to address this issue of suicide. So, but there's nothing, oh, it has to start here. It could start in any place, it could be in prisons, it could be in the police, it could be in medical, it could be in academia, it could be anywhere. So.
Yes, and final comment related to that point is that the leaders will have to be willing to take a risk.
And that was my closing comment. So you are spot on. So yes, leaders at every level will have to think differently, have to feel uncomfortable with their thinking. So I hope I made it, at some point, some of you cringe and, oh, that's wrong, or I couldn't do that. And because that's exactly, we need to challenge what we think we know about suicide. And we need to challenge our approaches to how we think we should be doing them. This is very different approach, admittedly. It's very different. It's very scary because we're empowering junior enlisted folks to make decisions. And oh my gosh, but we do this anyway, right? If you just followed anything going on in Iraq or in combat or in garrison, we empower our junior enlisted personnel to do all kinds of amazing things. And we should say, and this is one more thing that we're going to acknowledge that you're in charge of, but we want to work with you so you don't end your life and you live a full life. That's the most important thing. Don't focus on someone not ending their life. Focus on helping each other live full lives. That to me is the key. Focus on the positive aspects. What does it take to live a full, meaningful life? That's what I think Stoicism brings.
Thank you. Thank you for those words of wisdom. And so we come to the end of our webinar. Dr. Castro, thank you so much for presenting the Stoic approach to suicide and how we can not only understand, but also prevent suicide from that philosophical perspective. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope to see you soon in another webinar that will be presented by the MVP and also the School of Social Work. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.